Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. I'm also attorney of counsel with Law Group, and we work closely. I've closely followed this Rural Digital Opportunity Fund process from beginning until now. So it's definitely something that merits the kind of in-depth discussion that we hope to give it today. Before I introduce our three guests for the program, and we're very happy to have them, and also all of you who are joining us either on Zoom or YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter, we want to just mention a word or two. If you know about, if you like or have questions about Broadband Breakfast, please feel free to sign up for our email list or share it with others who you may know, who may also enjoy learning more about us. That helps us to grow and expand our reach and reach more people who want to understand the key aspects of better broadband and better lives that we are focused on. That's our motto at Broadband Breakfast: better broadband, better lives. And that means that we focus not just on the infrastructure, which is what we'll be talking about today, obviously, but we focus on the impact that that infrastructure has. We focus on the way it impacts our culture, our society, civic engagement, healthcare, work. In fact, we started this show, this ongoing series, Broadband Breakfast Live Online, nearly a year ago at the onset of the pandemic and its impacts. And we wanted to bring this community together around how broadband can make a difference in reacting to it. So we're very focused on that. In fact, our event next week will be on the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, the $3.2 billion program that FCC has recently issued rules on. And we hope many of you will come back for that. We also follow, of course, in addition to infrastructure, indeed, wireless infrastructure is part of infrastructure. And we're going to be talking about wireless issues today, inevitably. And we also, of course, follow the impact of broadband on our society and big tech and the culture. So now let's dive into RDOF. Stands for Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. For those who maybe are not as familiar with it, it's a continuation and perhaps an expansion of the FCC's use of reverse auctions. Okay, what is a reverse auction, right? I mean, people say, well, like, one of the great things about being a journalist, growing up as a journalist, right? I'm also an attorney, but as a journalist, we are not afraid to ask the dumb questions. And so I'd ask the dumb question, what is a reverse auction? Well, a reverse auction is when you have multiple sellers competing with one buyer, right? A normal auction, of course, you've got lots of buyers who are all in the auctioneer's house and the auctioneer's space, and the auctioneer trying to bid the price up so that you sell the product for the highest price. With the reverse auction, the seller are the people who want to provide broadband, and the buyer is the government who's going to subsidize it. So it's a reverse auction because the sellers are bidding the prices down that the buyer, the federal government, the FCC, is willing to pay to get broadband to those areas that have been defined, those locations. 7 million, I believe, locations were identified in this round. So I go into that little bit of an intro about reverse auctions to put the context here, because there has been a lot of criticism that the FCC got too good a bargain. They spent only $9 billion. They were going to spend $16 billion in this first round. They only spent around $9 billion, and they basically got lots of commitments for gigabit level service. And so that's certainly been a question in the air about fiber capacity, wireless capacity, and whether each of those technologies will meet their obligations. And we certainly will end up talking about that a little bit here today. But I do want to encourage our panelists to make sure we get to the topic, which is future-proof design, right product, and on-time execution. 3 essential steps for every Rural Digital Opportunity Fund winner. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to open it up to all of our guests. We have, speaking first will be Donnie Smith. Donnie is the CEO of FiberSmith. He'll say a little bit more about his company once he begins shortly, but I just might mention that FiberSmith is a design and engineering company that specializes in fiber to the premises, FTTP, and has worked quite extensively in the fiber design and construction space. for deployments. I will give a quick intro of the other two before we go back to you, Donnie, to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. Following Donnie will be Brian Regan. Regan, I apologize for not knowing which way. Which way is it, Brian?
It's Regan.
Regan. Okay.
Yeah,
So Brian Regan, who is the Vice President for Legal Policy and Strategy at Starry Inc., which is a very ambitious entity providing, as I understand it, wireless broadband, and was one of the significant winners in the this round of RDOF. And so he'll speak about where Starry is at on their efforts in RDOF and some of his thoughts on these 3 points about design, product, and execution. And then batting cleanup will be Sandeep Dhingra, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Network Services at Sterlite Technologies Limited, STL. STL is a very significant player globally and perhaps newer to US audiences, but globally, STL has been very involved with 25 years of experience in network planning, design, execution, and management of large-scale telecom and enterprise networks. So Sandeep will be able to tell us more about STL and the work that they've been doing in this space, particularly fiber deployment, but also fiber to the end node and wireless deployments on top of that. So with that, perhaps longer than normal introduction, I'm going to turn it over to you, Donnie, to talk for a few minutes about Fibersmith, who you are, and some of the projects that you're involved in on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund.
So thank you, Drew. My name is Donnie Smith, and I am with the Fibersmith Company. And I'm guessing since nobody is saying anything bad that you can see and hear me. Fibersmith has been a design engineering type company for fiber optics, generally fiber optic cable. We have done some wireless, but generally fiber optic cable to the end user for the last 8 years. And prior to that, I worked with an ISP that we had started to build fiber to the home in a 11 county area in Minnesota. So I've been working around it since about 1999 with fiber to the home. And as these points were laid out and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of discussion about us. You can find us on our website. You can find us by asking people who know us. And I don't want to waste everyone's time with a discussion about who I am and who Fibersmith is. But I have worked in the industry for a number of years to try and make broadband in the rural areas a reality. So as we were given the points that we were going to talk about in this, RDOF is the preeminent player right now. It's the gorilla in the room, and it's giving out $9.5 billion. And there is a lot of controversy about the money being given out. And again, I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but there's controversy that there was too little given out, too much given out, too much to some people, too little to other people. I think anytime you have a big system like this, you're going to have criticism on how it was handled. However, it did go off pretty easily. And I think when it's all said and done, that at the end of the day, this is going to be a boon for rural America, and they're going to get a lot of broadband built. So with that said, building a next generation broadband network, it doesn't really matter what you're using for the technology from the standpoint of building a network. You have to have some elements in common. And one of those is a GIS type system where you know where your assets are, what they do, what area they cover, how do people get it. And a lot of times that is going to be tied into a BSS OSS type thing, which is simply a business and operation system, which helps maintain the records and also connect people quicker to a network while doing it. And after you have access to your records and you know how you're building it, then you have to go about building it and keep those records of how it was actually built and where it was, both for records for troubleshooting and repair, but also for taxation and depreciation. And that's all tied into that GIS system and the BSS OSS or accounting or however the system is set up. The biggest problem that I see coming up, those types of systems are readily available. They're easy, relatively easy to set up. But where we're going to run into some problems over the next 5 or 6 years, in my opinion, is just on the availability and the delivery of products and services, meaning the material used to build a network, in our case, fiber materials, and the labor pool to do it, which is already being stressed just from things that have happened in the last year with COVID. There's been extra construction done. CARES projects have added construction. And so these added demands on the network supplies and the network labor and the construction labor is going to be something that's going to have to be watched very carefully over these next 6 years, especially for the people that were participating in RDOF, as they have a limited time frame to get their projects done. We worked with, in the long form, we worked with, we set up silos inside of our company so that we could work with multiple entities without violating the FCC's limited communications rules. And we set up 2 different consortiums that we worked with. And we also worked with a few individual companies to put this together. And then we added a couple more companies after the release of information on the 29th of, I think it was the 29th of January, early February, where we worked with a couple more people to help them get their long forms done. In the aggregate, this amounted to about $1.8 billion of the program, which is a pretty significant amount. 26 different companies, actually, out of the 417 that we were working with, were able to win and get money for this. This means that that group of customers, and this group is basically doing fiber. There's just a little bit of coax in it, and there's a very small amount of some wireless backhaul, and I think 2 census blocks of wireless. But this this pool is going to have to build nearly 100 miles of fiber a day. And when you start putting that strain on the supply systems, if people haven't worked that out ahead of time, there are going to be issues. So we've been working for the last 6 or 8 months to make sure this supply is going to be available. And then you need the ability to execute on the plan, and that's getting the final construction. If the material is there, the contractors will be available, and you have to make sure that they are. So again, we've been working on that, and I think that's about my time limit, and I think that's about all you need for a basis to start having discussion on this. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for raising those points. Let's go ahead and turn to you, Brian Regan, to tell us a little bit about STARI. For those who aren't familiar with it, tell us just briefly about it and how you view the RDOF opportunity as it's presented itself.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Appreciate it. So STARI, for those who are unfamiliar, is a hybrid fixed wireless fiber company that's deploying broadband across the country with a focus on providing new connectivity where it doesn't exist and competition where it doesn't exist today. The company was really founded around the belief that everyone deserves better broadband, and set out to try to solve that by driving down the cost of last mile broadband construction. I think as folks on this call and on the panel are fully aware, the cost of last mile construction is relatively fixed. There's not a lot of innovation that can happen there. So we try to figure out ways to bring that down, right? If you're going to come into an urban area and you're going to try to compete effectively with an incumbent, or you're going to try to extend the network out into more rural areas, the key requirement to do that without having to get 100% penetration within your economic model is to drive down the cost of that last mile connection. We do that primarily by operating as an integrated company. So we actually design and build our own fixed wireless equipment. We deploy that equipment, we operate our own network, and we provide our own service. So as a function of this integration is one of the key ways in which we're able to keep our cost structure down. The other component of that is we use exclusively licensed millimeter wave spectrum. So I think a lot of folks are familiar with the WISP ecosystem. A lot of WISPs are doing amazing stuff out there, providing incredible service to parts of the country that are completely unserved by fixed line technology. We're focused more on urban and some parts of the rural and suburban areas. But the key to what we're doing really ultimately is using licensed millimeter wave spectrum, which has a couple of benefits. One is high power, so that allows us to get over the sort of atmospheric absorption and other propagation losses that you're going to get in unlicensed millimeter wave spectrum. It gives you a geographic area basis for where your licenses exist and the customers that can go after your total addressable market. And it gives you protection across that basically into perpetuity, assuming you construct your network. So Starry has been really focused on providing this better broadband service over the last few years. We are operational now in 6 states plus the District of Columbia. Got a network that passes 4+ million households, and saw the opportunity. And RDOF is really a chance to bring our network and our service to parts of the areas in which we already hold licenses that we may take a little longer to get to. So the whole approach is really denominated in our spectrum license areas. We hold 24 gigahertz licenses in 51 partial economic areas, covers about 60 million pops. So very meaningful spectrum footprint that is a network that we're going to build out either way, and saw it as an opportunity to help us bring our connection, bring our service, and bring ultimately better broadband to parts of the market that may take us a little bit longer to get to. So we're really excited about the opportunity in RDOF. We won $270 million over 10 years to deploy across 9 states. And we see it as a really meaningful chance to just do what we can to improve connectivity in those parts of the market that historically haven't had it, along with Starry's overall goal of just growing our network and providing better broadband connectivity across the board within our license footprint. And ultimately, I think, you know, there's, as Drew said and Donnie mentioned as well, there are, you know, some complaints about the outcome of the auction, some claims that some folks won in ways that they shouldn't. I don't have a position on that one way or the other. I will say, I think we have a high degree of faith in the commission's ability to do effective diligence in the front end of the auction in the short form stage to effectively validate who can participate in the auction, and have every faith that they've got the skills and technical expertise and financial expertise to do it on the back end as well through the long form process, which we're all going through right now, and are confident we'll make it through that on the back end. And then ultimately, I think, as Donnie said, this accrues to the benefit of you know, millions of consumers across the country who don't have any access today. And I think on the whole should be thought of as a win in that context. While you can sort of nitpick on the edges, I think the fundamental outcome is an effective solution to get service to places today that don't exist. And we'll talk more about sort of planning and things like that as we get into it. But I think ultimately, as you approach these types of opportunities, these auctions, I think, as Donnie said, you really have to have a very good vision on the front end of your participation about what your strategy is going to be. To the extent your strategy is actually focused on true economics, you have to have a JS model, a network model that you can use to determine how you're going to deploy that network and the cost to deploy it, the revenue you can generate from it. And then you have to execute that in the auction, and then afterwards take that plan into action and ultimately build the network consistent with the SEC's milestones, which we could talk more about through the conversation.
May I just ask one more introductory type question, Brian? What geographies has Starry been in up until this, and what geographies are you now in as a result of it? Did it change it at all? Did it expand it kind of off of where you were? Just speak a little bit about those areas that you serve right now and will be serving.
Yeah, so it's really denominated in where we hold spectrum. So we hold spectrum across 51 partial economic areas. It's probably in, I don't know, 30 states that those economic areas, partial economic areas sit, that 60 million population. So the RDOF component is a subset of that. We want RDOF support in 9 states in the areas in which we hold spectrum licenses primarily.
Okay, great. So let's go ahead and turn to you, Sandeep, to tell us a little bit about the experience that STL has had in these types of deployments and some of the observations you have about how RDOF could be a game changer here in the United States.
First, thank you, Drew. Thanks for the invitation. And it's great meeting you, Donnie and Brian. Myself and STL both are new to this program. So I'll take this opportunity to talk a little bit about STL capabilities. The intent here is really to learn what are the requirements and pain areas and share our capabilities, our experience, and our capacity to see how we can help, where we can help. And where we can help is in terms of, let's say, in terms of augmenting capacity that you need, or in terms of really bringing technology or doing things faster, right? So that is the intent. Now, who we are, STL is basically, we call ourselves a data network innovator. We drive end-to-end data network solutions. We do design, deployment, both in the fiber area and wireless area. And Brian, as you said, we also are an integrated solution provider. That means we do the design and planning upfront. Then we have product as well in both in fiber as well as in wireless. And then we do the execution and operation and maintenance as well. I'll take some time because STL is new. I think it's my opportunity to introduce STL. So it'll take 5-6 minutes. Drew, I'll make sure that I take full time on that. We provide solutions mainly for, let's say, 4 main segments. One of the biggest segments we have is the citizen networks. When I say citizen networks, it's basically government programs for, let's say, rural broadband connectivity. So we are part of what is called BharatNet, where we are connecting 250,000. Think of this, we call it Gram Panchayat, like think of this as like village administrative bodies level. So like a middle mile connectivity. And then each of these endpoint then serves maybe 10, 12 or 20 other villages, right? So that's how we call it. This is part of the Digital India initiative. That is one of our biggest customers. Then we have telcos, large telcos as our clients. So we build broadband infrastructure for them. And we also build infrastructure in this area for large cloud providers, like think AWS, Azure, and this thing, right? For their point-to-point connectivities for, let's say, leased fiber across major metros. We also have large projects in defense, and specifically in India. Think Indian Navy. Now, we have a bulk of our business in India. Of course, we are present in various geographies in Europe, in China, in Brazil. But India is where we have bulk of our work done. 40% of all data that travels in India internet is through some kind of STL network. Now, other thing that we take pride on, so our portfolio is such that we have like from what we call silicon to software. So we have photonics-based research as well as the software that we have kind of multiple innovation centers. 5, I think we have a good number of patents. I think somewhere last count was 550 or something. We have state-of-the-art optical fiber and cable manufacturing plants capacity. We have it in India, we have in Brazil, we have in China, and we have in Italy, in Europe. We also have software data centers. So we are kind of in the middle, and we one of the bigger things that we do is the system integration. So essentially, we have 4 business units. One is the connectivity, which we talk about the fiber and all the wired connectivity products. And then we have our wireless product, where we provide disaggregated RAN kind of product in open RAN space in 4G and 5G. And then we have a software product division, which we have lots of OSS, BSS products, Wi-Fi and everything. And the 4th one is where we have our system integration. So end-to-end turnkey system integration for entire networks, where we do planning, design, deployment, operations, so on and so forth. So that is where we are able to provide that integrated solution brand, as you mentioned. And in addition, just a couple of things to note, right? We were the first plant in India that was zero waste to landfill optical fiber cable plant in the world. And then we, in terms of size and our capacity, we think of it like a little over 3,000 employees. We have about last year pre-COVID revenue was somewhere between 800 million. So we're kind of a mid-size company. And one thing that I want to touch upon what Donnie said. Donnie, I absolutely agree with you that digitization and automation that is based on location, specifically GIS location, in all phases of a network, whether it is from survey to planning to design to execution to deployment to compliance to, I think that is one of the most important pieces of these deployments. And we do have what we call the technology intervention. We do have lots of capabilities in this area, and hopefully sometime, maybe near future, we can share and learn from each other as well. So that is the introduction of my company, STL. I am the CTO here. As I said, I'm based in US, but I spend a lot of time in India meeting customers. And my background is networking and services. I worked in few of networking companies like Cisco. I worked for Huawei as well briefly, and spent a lot of time in IBM. But bulk of my time was in Cisco. Spent about 16 years of my career in Cisco and learned a lot. I'm really happy and glad to be here and to working with you all. And that's all from introduction perspective. Apologies if it was a bit longer.
No, you're right in the time zone here. So let me kind of use this to go to a question that I'm sure is on many people's mind, and forgive me if I start with the fireworks first, right? But there has been a lot of criticism of the awards, particularly in the realm of wireless space, and can wireless entities live up to their promises? Now, Brian, you are in the hot seat, you know that here. So please, would you be able to give your take? And I certainly want Donnie and Sandeep's as well. Is this just another false fight? Because I thought we had moved beyond a little bit of this. Everyone recognizes now that to even have a robust wireless network, you need to get fiber deep into the network. You need to get fiber to the endpoint. Could you just speak a little bit about kind of that technology debate that we're seeing right now, Brian, about whether fixed wireless providers are able to meet some of these ambitious RDOF goals?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jared. And maybe I'll start with a few framing comments at the outset. I think in any auction in which there are winners and losers, some folks that didn't participate as well, or the results were different than what they thought, have an opportunity to participate in effectively regulatory arbitrage after the fact to see what they can do to change those results. And there's a little bit of that happening here. And I get it, right? There are people that, and we're in the same boat, to be honest with you. We expected to do better. The auction was incredibly oversubscribed effectively, and the competition was incredibly aggressive, and price points fell incredibly low during the auction. And I think everyone was surprised by that. And there are some folks who lost that would have preferred to win more. We would have preferred to win more as well. And there may have been auction participants who took strategies that were not founded on the economics of their business. But I don't think you can paint a broad brush and just say that this is a problem of fixed wireless versus fiber versus satellite. It's an issue of how someone participated in the auction and whether or not they've got the technical, operational, and financial capability of building the network they're supposed to be able to build. Like I said at the outset, I think the commission has the skills to weed that out on the front end, and they certainly have the skills to weed that out on the back end, and we think they're going to do that. So I think from sort of a macro perspective, I think it's sort of a lot of noise about an outcome that some people don't like, but I think fundamentally the auction worked the way it was supposed to. The commission did the job they're supposed to do on the front end, and they're going to do the job they did on the back end. And if there are people where the commission doesn't think that they've got the operational, technical, or financial capability of providing the service, the commission has the skills to weed that out of the back end. From a technical perspective, I think the issue that people seem to have with fixed wireless is this assumption that the entire network is somehow fixed wireless, or that all fixed wireless networks and all fixed wireless technology is the same. And the reality, it isn't. You're 100% right that any wireless network is ultimately a hybrid network. It is ultimately a lot of fiber and some wireless on the last end, right? That's true of mobile networks. That's true of fixed networks. That's true of a network we would deploy as well. But that last mile connection that is fixed wireless can have a lot of different attributes and different capabilities depending on the technology that's deployed. I don't think there's any question that fixed wireless technology and wireless technology itself is capable of doing gigabit speeds. I don't think that's the thing that people are claiming. What they're trying to argue is that the mechanics of how you do it, the economics underlying it, the way that network operates is insufficient to be able to economically provide service at gigabit speeds. And I think that's a really hard thing to try to claim if you don't know the basic economics of an individual business. You don't know the specifics of each technology as it's deployed, and you haven't done a full network analysis of how that's going to work. That's incumbent on the party that's participating in the auction to do on the front end. It's incumbent on them to show it to the commission on the back end, and then it's incumbent on them to deliver on the back end as well. And the last thing I'll say is, a lot of the fixed wireless providers, us included, qualified as fixed wireless and fiber, right? At the end of the day, the obligation is to deploy the network that's capable of providing a gigabit service. For us, we do that by using licensed millimeter wave spectrum, which is absolutely capable of providing gigabit speeds. We do it today. I don't think anyone's out there claiming that mobile 5G providers are incapable of doing gigabit speeds. They are. They prove it. It's just a question of how you build the network to actually achieve that in the locations in which you have to do it. We've got a network model that we think is effective in doing that for doing fixed wireless and gigabit speeds today. We're going to deploy that in the areas which we want RDOF, and then we're going to deploy fiber as well as part of that. So I think we've got a good solution for it, and I think ultimately this is a question that's before the commission. I think they're going to do a good job of weeding out those that may have been bad actors in it.
Well, very, very convincing answer, Brian. I'd love to hear Donnie's reply to that, if he has one.
I don't think it's so much as a reply, because mostly I agree with Brian on everything he said there. I think there's some things that a lot of people are overlooking. I think I said we represented 26 different companies through this process. And of those 26, I think 12 of them are pure wireless companies, but not a single one of them is actually bidding wireless, which is kind of interesting. And yet they're being criticized for deploying a wireless network, which they don't plan to do. I think one of the other things that's also interesting is wireless providers in the past in general have tended to work well together. And I think that's going to show up here. I think companies like, and Brian, I'm going to pick on yours for a second since you're on the call, but companies like Starry are going to be working with other winners that won fiber.
You've gone mute, Donnie. You muted yourself. There we go.
Pardon me?
You muted for a moment. You just started to say wireless.
I'll come in and it automatically muted it. So sorry about that. But I think companies like Starry are going to work with companies that are already putting down fiber in some of the areas around them, near them, and that's how they're going to get some of their backhaul. I think there's a lot of cooperation that is going to go on between these companies to help make some of the disconnected areas work better. Again, in an auction, there's always going to be winners and losers, and losers don't like to lose any more than winners don't like to lose. Nobody likes to lose, and so you're always going to hear things after the auction. The FCC has spent a lot of time doing this. They did a reasonably good job in CAF 2 with the same types of rules and the same types of procedures, and it's worked pretty well. It's going to take time for this all to unwind. The FCC still has, I believe they still have 2 companies that haven't been finalized in their CAF 2 awards, which happened some time ago. But in general, this bulk of this stuff is going to start moving, and there is nothing wrong inherently with taking wireless to the house, as it's all physics, and you can do a lot of things with those physics to make these things happen. Brian touched on a couple of them from the technical side, but very lightly. Power gets through a lot of things, and there are regulations on how much power can be used. So if there are ways to get into this licensed spectrum where you can use more, you can actually get a little bit more done with it. I think a lot of the people that are criticizing wireless, and I probably fall into this camp a little bit, is simply that it's not a permanent solution. But the other side of that is it costs less to do, and so you can tend to replace it every now and then. Brian, if I'm being unfair on that, let me know. But where fiber tends to be a more permanent solution without as much CapEx upgrade costs later in its life.
Well, let's certainly get reactions on this, but I want to get Sandeep into this discussion, how you have worked with both fiber and wireless, from an endpoint. How do you view this discussion and conversation in the work that STL has done globally and with a particular eye to RDOF proposals? Sandeep.
Yeah, I think Brian and Donnie covered most of the things. I'll probably end up saying the same thing in different words, but I'll try and bring an outside perspective. See, what I see that is, let the use case, let the user requirement define. And those, Brian put it very nicely. You talk about from a technical feasibility perspective, you talk about operational needs, and you talk about financial needs. You know, if you require, you can't really have upfront capex, then probably fiber is not the best option. If you are looking for reliability and SLAs over a period of long time, different type of speeds, different type of communities. So our position, my position is we basically become technology agnostic. Let the requirements define what it is, and then you do the best job. Because if we do not do that, doesn't matter what is your inclination, you are not going to do the optimum job, right? So that is, we take it from the user customer need perspective. And once you put that in the table and put in pros and cons, the answer will be very clear. If you just have a simple scoring system, this is what my need, is this the opportunity? There will be very few gray areas. The network today, tomorrow, and ever is going to be hybrid. I can predict that whether it is 4G, 5G comes in, whether it is fiber, there is a need and place for both, and both need to work together to make it successful. That's how I see it. In fact, there's another element that is coming into play is the convergence at the edge. That is an additional thing that we'll be talking about, world is talking about and moving towards, but probably that's another discussion. So net, I agree. I believe user requirements should define that, and it is going to be a hybrid network.
Any additional thoughts on this, Brian, before we kind of leave this topic to go to our main topic, if you will?
Yeah, I think this is a good conversation.
So let's talk a little bit about the way we get there, right? And so starting with the first of the three elements we've highlighted here, namely the design and the design necessary. What are some aspects of how that works? What's different in the RDOF design, if anything, than your typical design, Brian and Donnie and Sandeep? Your thoughts on that too, let's take that question first. I've got a lot more on the product and the execution, but just starting sort of one at a time. What are your thoughts on the design aspect? Let's start with, again, Brian and Donnie and Sandeep.
Yes, I think it's sort of a three-step process if you're going into the auction based on a strategy that's focused on, where you can economically serve with a given subsidy in a given round. The first is before the auction, you have to have a pretty detailed network analysis that you can use to determine the CapEx requirements and the revenue that you can generate from serving a particular census block group or the census blocks within a census block group. That's not an easy thing to do, and it can scale really largely, right? In RDOF, there were 60,000 census block groups that you'd have to analyze based upon the type of strategy you're going to execute. But you really need that as the fundamental thing before you ultimately move into a strategy and focus on the financial model that you ultimately use to execute within the auction. You bring that into the auction. And then on the outset, when the auction's over, you've got a set of census block groups that you've ultimately won based upon your initial analysis. You refine that analysis, both for the purposes of doing the long form, but really as you start to think about operationalizing that network. And I think as Donnie talked about, 3 years is really ultimately not a ton of time. So you got to start pretty quick after the end of the auction to take that network model and that analysis, improve it, and then
just to jump in, by 3 years, you're referring to the percentage that needs to be built out within 3 years. Could you just say that for everybody?
Yeah, so the FCC benchmarks are you have to cover, provide service or offer service to 40% of the locations in each state in which you won support by the end of the 3rd year after you are awarded the support, and then an incremental 20% thereafter until you hit 100% by the end of the 6th year. So you really do have to have a pretty effective plan from day one, as of December of 2020 to really start to execute towards, assuming you're going to get the support, if you're really doing this in a true way in which you plan to execute and actually deliver the service. And then the third piece is you start to build and you iterate on that process as you go, right? It's not going to perfectly match your model 100% of the time. So as you get facts on the ground, you go through the deployment process, you're continuing to improve your planning or change your planning depending on what's happening in that local area. And lastly, as Donnie mentioned, ultimately this is probably going to be a very collaborative effort. That's the way we tend to think about things. We bring in really good, effective partners as we scale our business. And that's the kind of thing that we'll continue to do, and I'm sure others will as they go into these markets. That includes partnering with the local governments as well, making sure that you're deploying a network that meets their broadband goals, that meet their digital equity goals as well.
Donnie, what are your thoughts? And I'm not sure where the name Fibersmith comes from, but it just has that ring of like, hey, we're going to design these networks. So tell us just a little bit about your thoughts on the design piece there.
So Brian did a really good job of describing what that process is going to look like, whether it's wireless or fiber. A lot of the difference is going to come into what that type of design is.
You've gone on mute again. Sorry.
With spectrum right now. So I apologize, guys. I'm on the road today, and so I'm on my cell phone, and every time somebody tries to ring in, it mutes me out. But a lot of the processes are the same, but instead of doing budget losses of fiber light, now if we're in wireless, you're doing budget losses with the signal. And it's the same type of thing. The difference of doing rural versus urban is generally you have much lower density, which means your distances are much longer to deal with, which makes it more difficult for wireless because of the distance that you need to propagate a signal, and more difficult for fiber because of the increased distance you have to place plant in the ground that doesn't necessarily have a return on it. So you have this bridging fiber that has to go in, even though there might be 2 miles between a house that you have to cover to get to that second house. So that's the real biggest difference. But as far as designing a rural network, whether it's part of RDOF or not part of RDOF, there's very little difference in design. The only other real difference is that because of the way RDOF is set up, it's not always easy to make a contiguous network, which works much better with a fiber network if you can keep it contiguous.
Okay. Good thoughts again, and these bleed into each other. But just to kind of continue, Sandeep, I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about the algorithm-based design tool and the GIS-based approach that STL brings to your work in network design.
Yeah. So basically, we have our approach to design is first time right. Take as much energy and time. There's a saying I remember: more you sweat in peace is less you bleed in war, right? So if you really design right, there will be least amount of rework, and you can even have better speed. And that the way we try to do that is we try to digitize and automate the entire piece, whether it is on our GIS. We have our homegrown GIS. We use QGIS as the platform, but we have, over the period of last 10 years or so, we have built tremendous amount of tools, and we have collected lots of data as well. And we map this entire network, whatever we are planning on the GIS, right? Based on previous engineering rules and algorithms, we try to come with optimum design. Then we have this 100% digitization from the surveys. We use these design tools in each and every piece, whether it is generating automatic BOQ based on past experiences, the planning level details, whether it is from the home to the longer distance, front haul to back haul, that are done first on the desktop, on the GIS platform, and then we do the survey validation, and then we basically, based on that, we do execution planning. Like, for example, we do part of this digitization is soil and strata analysis, right? Whether it is hard soil, medium soil, or soft soil for underground, where we need to do aerial, for example, right? And how. So those are the things. We also provide design as a service in many of the geographies, because that's something that we have a lot of experience as such. And I think that is one of the critical capability. And just to summarize it, or in one line, I would say our approach is we have to always get it right for the first time. We do not want to do rework, and we want to make sure that efforts are put in the designing phase adequately in planning phase.
I've gotten a question from one of our audience members that I think is appropriate for this point in the discussion. So kind of push it in here about wireless rural expansion. How can one avoid substantial fiber and build costs through wireless? Because by comparison, cities, you have smaller networks, you have shopping mall, kind of maybe anchor networks, so to speak, that are ringed together. But in rural, there's just long straight roads. So could either of you, Donnie or Brian or Sandeep, talk just briefly about the issue of wireless rural expansion and how to keep those costs, the fiber costs, I guess, down? Let's start with you, Brian.
Yeah, I think part of it is thinking about last mile fixed wireless connectivity, not as a function of rural or urban, but as a function of household density that's serviceable under a given vertical asset that may already exist or that you might be able to construct. And I think that's kind of the starting point in how you think about the viability of a fixed wireless solution in any area. Is there a vertical asset in which you can construct? Are there enough households or locations underneath that in which you can earn a payback on that investment? And can you get backhaul to that location one way or another, right? Whether that's fiber or in the case of fixed wireless, one of the benefits you have is that you can do point-to-point fixed wireless and gigabit as a backhaul solution as well that can cover relatively long distances if you're up in E-band or microwave bands as well. So really that's the starting point of the analysis. And it's not this issue of rural urban, it's an issue of sort of serviceability underneath a given vertical asset that you may construct or that may already exist there. Whether that's a telephone pole or whether it's a tower or any other tall asset that you can use. And I think WISPs have been incredibly creative about this over the course of the history of all WISPs, right? That they all tend to operate in areas in which there aren't fixed line operators and do very well doing that. So that's how we tend to think about it is, where are areas in which we have relative confidence in our ability to provide service with assets that exist or that can be built.
Thanks. Great response. Don, do you have anything to add to that?
So from a fiber standpoint, instead of looking at vertical assets, we usually look at horizontal assets. And when there isn't enough asset along a route to make sense to put it in, that's when we look to a microwave wireless type link to lower the cost of getting through that stretch without that don't have the assets that you need to pay for the line. So like Brian alluded to, relatively long distance with a relatively low cost. And then at the point you get to the other end, and now you can easily get 8 gigabits through there, and you can get more doing a few things. Then you can start distributing fiber on the other end again, where you actually have enough to pay for the assets you're putting in the ground.
Great. Good. I'd love to move to this discussion that I know Sandeep will have a lot to say on about materials and manpower, because that is really our second of the three that we've laid out here, the access to the right materials, equipment, and skilled resources, some of which are currently many months delayed. In fact, let's actually start with you, Sandeep, speaking a little bit about materials availability and manpower shortages and some of the ways STL has helped to address those bottlenecks.
Yeah, I think that this goes to what Brian was saying, right? If you control or if you provide a solution that has integrated approach from design to product to execution, you can reduce inefficiencies that are caused because of material delay. So we produce our own fiber cable and fiber optics in all those connectivity products ourselves, right? So that we have much better control compared to, let's say, if somebody else was building. And we also have designed this thing, so we know what will be the motions and timelines and resources that will be needed overall, so we can reduce those efficiencies as well. So I'll come to manpower, and then before I come to manpower, we talk about the technology area, right? In terms of how do you execute, and technology that comes into many forms, right? Like how do you use, let's say, a drone-based surveys, and then when you are executing, how do you be predictive in terms of the project cost, in terms of complexity of program management and project management. So we
could you say a word on drone? How do you use drones in the product cycle?
So we do mostly are used for the survey. It's for land surveys and before your deployment or before your design. So when you have large stretches of area, then a drone is much more feasible and much more. There are other, we do photogrammetric vehicles as well, 3D vehicles as well, but drones is something in rural area makes much more sense. So in terms of, let's say, when I say, when we control in an integrated approach, all of these aspects, and I'm going to come to manpower in a minute because I want to cover that separately, but from a design and product and execution perspective, and you use technology and you use in all phases, and then you basically, mastered execution over a period of time and experience learning from that. And I can go a little bit more details on it. But from manpower perspective, our experience in when we expanded to Europe and all, we basically, our approach has been to skill the local resources first. We have our own STL Academy, where we have trained already about 7,500 folks in, let's say, deployment, splicing, and all of various trades from designing to deploying to splicing and everything. And then we also have tied up, for example, in UK, we have tied up their biggest training provider to train the local resources available in advance when we do. We also have local presence in terms of leadership and key resources in the geographies, let's say in US and UK to do. And then we can, the third piece is we do the augmentation of capabilities as well. So we have, now that we are a global company, we have a pool of flexible resources that we can deploy quickly. When I say quickly, I'm not talking matter of weeks, I'm talking matter of months. Of course, we are really talking about cross-border things here, but we do have strategies and plans to wherever needed, we can augment. So again, our manpower, our strategy is first local, reskilling the local, use technology to kind of reduce the cost and time and increase efficiencies, and then augmentation through a flexible pool of key resources globally, and then have leadership and key resources on the ground as well. That is how we have approached this.
No, awesome. Donnie and Brian, what are some of the questions or issues you all have on the materials and manpower side of these, execution phase? Donnie.
So for us, we've been working on this, on the material and the manpower side for almost 10 months already, making assumptions that we were going to have customers that won some portion of what we were bidding on. And so we have actually been, it's funny, even though Sandeep and I have never met each other, Sterlite is one of the companies we've been working with to get cable from. So we have projections for the next 6 years by the quarter over what kind of cable is going to be needed to do the production of what we're planning to build, planning to engineer and build. And not just the cable, but all of the miscellaneous parts that go along with it, whether it's bolts and nuts for a pole connection or conduit for underground. And that has all been pushed out to manufacturers through distribution. And we're working on a project right now where we're talking about multi-week availability instead of multi-month availability, or even if some of the stuff is stretching into a year, we're talking about having delivery on these products from warehouses within a 2 or 3 week period of time. From the labor standpoint, we've been working the same type of deal with different contractors, where we're taking some of the contractors that we have worked with in the past and basically guaranteeing them their work for the next 4 or 5 years to complete this stuff, to be able to get it done on time, on schedule. And I'm afraid there's going to be some companies that really didn't do any of this planning, and they're going to find it very difficult to get any materials at all in a reasonable basis, and they're going to have trouble meeting their milestones because of it. So that's how we're handling it.
Important points, particularly on the fiber end. I'm not sure how much fiber you need, Brian. I'm sure there's some, but talk a little about these issues in the product and manpower side.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sandeep and Donnie really nailed it. This comes down to really good, thoughtful planning on the front end, coming up with an effective strategy for ensuring that you've got the resources you need to deploy the network, purchasing it when you can, and then building the teams in a strategic way that makes the most sense, and leveraging existing partnerships and new partnerships where you have the ability to do that. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Star is ultimately going to do. We design and build our own technology, so we've got our own technology ecosystem that we manufacture and have our own supply chain that's associated with that. RDOF is ultimately a relatively small part of the network that we're going to be building over the next 5 years. So from our perspective, it's a small incremental increase in what we would ultimately be planning for anyway, but it's not really going to fundamentally change the structure of the way that we're managing our supply chain or our partnerships. And I think Donnie and Sandeep kind of nailed this, that you're going to ultimately have to leverage some existing or new relationships with other partners, whether that's a fiber provider, a fiber deployer, or a company like Donnie's, or an infrastructure construction company, folks like Tilson or Quanta. I think it's going to be the kind of exercise where you're going to have to aggregate lots of different resources, do it in an effective way, do it in a well-planned way, and ultimately, I think it's going to be a boon to the local communities in which you're going to get access to this technology. It's going to, not only result in some new construction in that area and hopefully some new long-lasting jobs, but also, generate additional economic activity through new connectivity that didn't exist there before.
What, if I may, Brian, what's the kind of core manpower, person power needs that Starry needs? I mean, like, is it, again, you've got a hybrid network as we've discussed, so you've got to do some of that construction, quote unquote, but then you've also got the equipment component. Could you just speak of another minute or two about how that plays into your product deployment, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. It's relatively light. I mean, it's a fixed wireless network that doesn't need as much construction as a fiber network by design. So you've got a few teams that are able to do tower attachments. You've got some teams that do maintenance, and then you've got teams that do the customer side of it. And that customer side of it is ultimately kind of roving as you scale the network across the markets in which you exist, and really trying to leverage as much as possible skilled techs in the areas in which we're going to deploy, that know the market, that know the people, and know the community, to be able to help us build in those places that we're going to go.
Great. Well, we are running towards the end of our time. We have gotten an excellent question here from Alyssa Tracy. I'm going to combine this and my last question and give each of you a chance to reply. This is, how do RDOF partners plan to engage with the local municipalities, townships, or areas in which they're serving? And let's kind of use that to springboard into, the execution, right? The process of completing these networks in all of its totality. We've talked about design, we've talked about the product and the person power necessary. What's the other element? What else needs to happen, including those partnerships with municipalities, townships, and areas? Let's go with Donnie, Sandeep, and Brian. I'll let you have the last word on this. So go ahead, Donnie.
So when you start talking about how are they going to engage with municipal entities, and I'm just going to say municipal to include every type of entity that's governmental, there are several things that are going to come to happen. First, there's permitting especially for wireline, but also wireless. There's anything to do with towers or vertical assets. Generally, there are permits available. And so this isn't going to come as a surprise to any of the municipalities. They're going to be in the front end of the process because that's where they have to be. And then after that, it gets more complex. And this is not a shot at anybody. There are municipalities, and again, I'm using that in the large context, that love to have you there. And they are going to bend over backwards to make everything work and that you can get broadband to their constituents. And there are others that will do everything they can to make sure it is almost impossible, from making it an excessively expensive process to excessively time consuming to vacillating on what the requirements are. And it can slow a process down to the point of literally stopping it for years. So it's in the best interest of the provider to make as good a relationship as they can. And they will, from my experience, every one of them will try to make the best connections they can. But at a certain point, they get frustrated if it isn't happening right. And that makes a much more difficult situation. So from a municipal side, the best thing you can do is to welcome these people so they can help get your goals accomplished. They will try to make sure that even though you may not be part of the RDOF, and I'll speak for Brian on this. Sorry, Brian, I'll let you talk for yourself. But if Brian has a vertical asset that can reach your town hall and it isn't part of his RDOF area, he is going to figure out how to get you service there if that's what you want. And so will the fiber providers to the point that they can. But it maybe is a little easier to do it from a tower than it is from underground. But a lot of these providers are planning to build the towns as they get there as well. It's not just to build the areas that are RDOF, but to build the areas around them. It's just that the RDOF is going to take precedence because of the timeline.
Well, wonderful thoughts here. Let's let Sandeep reply to this question of municipalities and your closing thoughts on the execution aspect.
So very quickly, see, we have tremendous amount of experience in dealing with municipalities in other geographies, not in US. And we call it right of way. And this is like art and the science in terms of we'll have all type of municipalities, all type of regulations. And that's where we do a very robust program management from a process perspective, say end-to-end deployment, per meter deployment, or per kilometer or per mile deployment. We have all these things built in, which is the actual deployment and getting the regulatory permissions and all of those things. And we can actually, in India at least, we can predict how long it is going to take based on even these softer considerations as well. And the second piece is, so one point I'm making is that in terms of data-driven predictability of even getting these regulations is something that helps us plan better. Second aspect of this is, a lot of this is, besides what Donnie said, it's about relationships as well. A lot of this comes into non-technical thing. If you can build relationship, convince them that you can deliver it in time, and you have the capability to execute quickly, you generally get good response. Now, that is our experience outside US. In this case, I think there will be a lot for us to learn from both Brian and Donnie and all the RDOF partners.
Great. Wonderful. Thanks for being with us. Now, Brian, you get the last word for our discussion here today.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. And thanks, Melissa. It's an awesome question, and I think it's a really important part of this. Obviously, RDOF winners are going to work very closely with the FCC and make sure that what they're doing is meeting the goals that the FCC set out in the context of the RDOF program. But really, fundamentally, this is a local program, and I think it's incumbent upon all the RDOF winners to spend a lot of time with the local governments in which they want support, understand what their broadband goals are, and understand what the digital equity needs are, and work to build that into their network plans. That's something that Starry does as a matter of course as we build out our network. We've got great relationships with every market that we're in right now. We've got a program called Starry Connect, in which we partner with the local housing authority as well to provide low-cost service to affordable housing in those communities. And we think it's fundamental to the mission that Starry actually was built to achieve, which is just give everyone better broadband to the greatest extent that we can. So I think it's a really fundamental part of this. And it's really about working together with them to the greatest extent you can. And as Donnie said, these providers, us included, want to help. They want to be a part of your community and want to help bring broadband to all of your residents and help improve connectivity where they can.
Well, wonderful final words from each of you. Before we thank our guests, I just want to remind you that we'll be back next week on Wednesday, March 10th, with the discussion of the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. And please make sure to subscribe to our email announcements and also our other channels of distribution. I'm on behalf of Donnie Smith, CEO of FiberSmith, Brian Regan, Vice President of Legal Policy and Strategy at Starry, and Sandeep Dhingra, Chief Technology Officer at Sterlite Technology Limited, STL. I'm Drew Clark of Broadband Breakfast. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next week. Take care.